Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I commend your bravery for coming out in these deeply troubled times. So my name's John Gavin. I'm on the board of ISITC. We work with the CISI, and this is part of a programme of activities that we're running with them. This particular point with regard to the subject, really with regard to cloud, came up with us about 8 or 9 months ago, where we were having an internal event. We have our membership covers both the investment management side and the broking side and the exchanges, and there was quite a long discussion which came up around whose cloud are you using, how are you using it, and if you want to move from one environment to another, how can you manage it? And the topic of standards was kind of brought up then. It's been followed up at a couple of smaller meetings, and then last November, AFME, which is I would say one of the leading bodies in the European finance, published this document, which I think is a really excellent document about adoption of cloud computing in the capital markets. And for those of you who get a chance, I'd strongly suggest that have a read of it. So, the adoption of cloud, I think everyone's very aware of the various flavours of cloud, but it does come with some questions, about how moving away from moving your legacy into a cloud environment. There are a significant number of compliance issues that you have to look at as well. So it's quite a complex journey to move for anyone who's been engaged in it, moving from an in-house environment out to a cloud or even use of public cloud. So that's what we're going to have a discussion about today. What we really want to do today, and quite a lot of this time is going to get some feedback from the floor, because what we're looking at, and it's been raised internally at ISITC, was around whether we should look to set up a cloud a formative cloud standards body. So anyone who's got any thoughts on that, please raise the points and come and have a discussion with us afterwards, or raise your points during the session. Now, we've been very fortunate here today because we're going to get an introduction from David Ostovich. David is the CIO of AFME, and it was his team that put together this rather comprehensive paper, which I think actually covers a significant number of areas that we can't touch on them all today, but David's going to do an introduction. We then got to move into, shall we say, some of the nuts and bolts issues. We've got Alistair Hodge. Alistair is an engineer by profession and has actually been engaged in moving people onto the cloud, getting cloud interoperability actually as a reality in a number of very large financial services organisations, but also has experience from other industries as well. So Alistair will be speaking about that. So what we're planning to do is David will address you first for 10 to 15 minutes to talk about the issue and the subject matter covered by the paper, and then Alistair will follow that, talking about some of the practical issues, and then we're going to have a gargantuan discussion. So if everyone's comfortable with that, we'll move forward. So David, perhaps if we can.
Well, thank you, John, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. And thank you to ISITC and CSI for the invitation today as well. So to help today's discussion, I'll just provide a little bit of background about AFME and our work in technology and cap markets, focus on the paper John mentioned on public cloud adoption, and then I just want to put some thoughts out there about the emerging regulatory or policy landscape around public cloud, which I personally think is quite interesting, but I would say that. For those not familiar with AFME, so we're a pan-European trade association for investment banking in Europe. Our main role is lobbying or making direct representation to authorities and governments across Europe and member states. We provide a lot of thought leadership, events, and a collective space for the industry to discuss a range of topics. And we work with sister organizations in the US and Asia as well to bring a global perspective on many of these topics. I run our technology and operations division. So we look at three main areas: resilience and cybersecurity, no surprise, a huge priority for the industry. What we call technology innovation, so it's looking at things such as cloud, AI, digital assets, distributed ledger technologies. And now data and transformation. So we've done a lot of work around industry utilities and shared platforms. We're also seeing a lot more focus now in wholesale markets around open data and data sharing as well, moving on from a PSD2 context. We're led by a committee of EMEA level COOs and CIOs, and then just a range of working groups with expertise from our member firms. So just taking a quick step back, in 2018, we commissioned a report with PwC to look at trends in technology innovation in capital markets and where we thought things were going, what it means for the investment bank of the future. And it really just solidified for us as membership that technology is now a strategic pillar for all firms. Again, no surprises there. Range of technologies we think will be very influential now and into the future, of which cloud was seen as a foundational element to underpin lots of innovation and business change as well. And all this is trying to create banks that are a bit more automated, data-led, open, agile, and really address the challenges that banks face, which is changes the competitive environment. You've got Brexit, you've got new regulations coming in, you've got single-digit growth, we've got COVID-19. Technology is seen now as a lever to try and address some of those challenges as well. And the key advocacy messages that we've been lobbying for the last 5 years or so is about balancing that risk and innovation at the same time as the industry and firms and regulators try to get to grips with some of these new technologies as we go. And just one graphic from that report, we asked our members back then what they thought the constraints were on public cloud adoption. Legacy technology, unsurprisingly for banks, top issue, and also regulatory concerns. But through interviews with members, we also got things such as vendor lock-in, security concerns, price points, a whole range of potential barriers to public cloud adoption in the industry. So as Gary mentioned, the back end of last year, we did a separate report purely focused on public cloud adoption to dive in. And what we want to do is provide more of a quantitative assessment for the industry on where is public cloud being adopted, what are some of those real barriers, and what can the industry do to try and increase the adoption of public cloud. So we saw that obviously public cloud adoption is seen to be increasing, and it's a priority for firms, especially seeing that from regulators as well, much more focus on it. The statistic here around the adoption rate, the reason why we looked at some of these numbers is we wanted to almost cool the market in some ways, because certainly from a regs perspective, there's a lot of belief that banks are already running off, doing lots of public cloud, moving critical things there, where what we were seeing from members is it's still at an early stage, it's still maturing, and where it's been applied will come to as well. And some of the business benefits around agility, to be able to spin up environments, to do testing, innovation projects, look at cost management, to go where you can to a pay-as-you-go type model, and then potentially digital native products, so enhancing client and customer experience as well. And we identified around 5 use cases, from capacity bursting all the way through to using cloud to increase resilience. And again, the key message here for our report was public cloud seems to be being used in capital markets to almost supplement existing business lines or services. It's experimental in some ways. It's certainly not being used wholesale into very critical functions of the bank, if you think about end-to-end post-trade life cycle or some of that post-trade activity. And then we focused on the barriers and came up with five areas. So the first, again, legacy IT architecture in capital markets. As you know, banks are very complex IT estates, both organic and through mergers and acquisitions. And again, banks are providing very complex, critical activities to the economy. They're highly regulated. So any technology change is difficult, let alone trying to move to something that's seen as more transformational, like public cloud adoption. And within here as well, it's around the skills for the future as well. So do firms really have the right people? Are they organized the right way to take fully advantage of public cloud and cloud platforms? What's around commitment and investment, it's very difficult to show return often on cloud. A lot of benefits you might get from some of these platforms can be intangible. There's also a bit of an inflection point in the industry where there's been probably at least 3-4 years of quite significant investment in innovation, new technologies. And now banks are really having to start to show some return on that investment as well. And that is potentially a bit of an issue for cloud adoption over the next few years. And we just saw that the banks that have the executive support and buy-in are the ones that are potentially looking to be the fast adopters and move first. there's been quite a number of banks that have been quite skeptical in their cloud adoption, and we're starting to see now more of our members take more of a cloud-first type approach as well as they start to realise the benefits. From a regulatory perspective, one of the main ones last year was the European Bank Authority's guidelines on outsourcing, which came out. Before that, it was their guidelines on cloud outsourcing. This is trying to harmonise the rules and regulations around cloud adoption. What we see, certainly within Europe, the requirements of regulators is different. What's required from a supervisory perspective is different. So for most banks that are cross-border and global in nature, you often have to go to different regulators, show different things, and that just adds friction to the system. So while the regs environment is moving in the right way, now there's more focus on it. There is a danger that there's more local requirements like data localization. And we're seeing in Poland, for example, they've released new guidelines where if something's seen as critical, then it might need to reside in Poland. If it's really critical, it needs to reside in a Polish data center. Again, for a bank that's trying to use cloud, that could be an obstacle. The contractual technical standards, I know something we'll talk about here, and then Alice will certainly go into a lot more detail. The cloud model of one-to-many and having a standard terms of business is often difficult. So to make sure firms get their own requirements in there, to get regulatory requirements, that's been quite a lot of focus for the industry. And then every platform is different as well. So if the preferred approach is a hybrid approach, which is using both public and private cloud and on-premise for a bank, then the differences in those services make it quite technically difficult. There's no real standards around contracts. There's no real standards around audit and certifications. Well, there certainly are, but are they all consistent, and does it make it easy? So we're seeing a lot of focus there. And one of the areas that we're starting to get asked a lot in the industry is, could we at least get some standards around how every bank goes to a cloud provider to do a risk assessment? And if we could agree that with all the cloud providers, then that would certainly try and make this pre-phase a bit easier. And the final one, concentration risk, which has come up really the last 12 months, but now top of most regulators' agenda. So this is the idea that there's a small number of large cloud providers that we're all familiar with. Our banks, and I think most banks, prefer these hyperscale providers because they've got the range of services, they've got the investment in security and resilience, they're innovating. But there's concentration of those providers, there's concentrations of where those providers are located, there's concentration of the services that banks are using in those providers, and there's this understanding in the industry at the moment around, is this presenting a future systemic risk? So if one cloud provider was to go down, what would that mean? And if we think around some of the difficulties on technical standardization, so portability of data, if it's not easy to move between providers and a provider was to go down, then potentially what that is. So I'll maybe touch on this one in the end as well. So we finished the report by coming up with 14 recommendations, because that's what all good lobbyists do, and we grouped them into 4 areas. The key takeaway here for me is that it's a problem really for banks, for the regulators and the cloud providers all together. It's those 3. So maybe just jump into number 4. We often say a lot about we need to share knowledge and collaborate and best practice, and these forums are fantastic for that. I think with public cloud adoption, it's key because it is those 3 that need to come together to support the industry. For banks, I think it's focusing really on where you think the value and adoption of public cloud will be and where it won't be. It's having that commitment to change over multi-years as well. For the cloud providers, we've certainly seen over the last few years, the regulatory focus has helped bring cloud providers and the industry closer together. So, for example, they have standard terms of businesses now for FS, which largely address most of the key requirements. They're looking at bringing in their own multi-cloud platform, so Google, so the Anthos platform is an example of that. There's still a lot more cloud providers can do to build assurance in the industry, so build some trust with us and regulators, and also promote more consistency and standards as well. Good examples might be pooled audits and helping us do some of those. And for regulators, it's really about trying to get that harmonization, certainly across Europe, but looking at this as much as they can in the global context, if we think about the concentration risk, because trying to resolve some of that purely in the UK or in Europe won't help if they are global providers. And for regulators to really focus on that data localization issue as well, because that's a big problem. It's often not so apparent where that resides, but then you look at some regulations and certain risks and how you might assess your systems, and it turns out you have to keep data in a location. So it's really trying to break some of those barriers down. And I just want to finish with just a view around the policy agenda. So there's a number of initiatives going on at the moment, all relate to cloud, and will have long-term impacts for the industry and for our members. So in Europe at the moment, they're doing a review of what they call digital operational resilience. They've released a new EU data strategy. There's two big parts of these consultations and questions, which is asking direct questions on should ICT third-party providers, cloud providers be regulated? And that's a big question for us in the industry. And maybe one we can talk about later is should cloud providers fall under a regulatory perimeter if they are systemically important? But for example, in the top one, the resilience, some of the solutions to this problem they're proposing would be things such as a mandatory requirement on banks to have multiple providers, a mandatory requirement on banks to have to cycle through those providers, setting up a supervisory college that could look at concentration risk and take action on firms to potentially not engage with a vendor or to come out of a vendor for certain services. So for us, that's taking away the ability of banks to be proportionate, take a risk-based approach, be commercial in their decisions. They're also looking at a federated cloud, so really trying to build a cloud platform for Europe to rival the US platforms. Again, that's looking for investment from the private sector. Questions about what does that mean? Will banks have to use it? What's it mean for competition in the market? We're also looking at some voluntary contractual clauses for cloud providers as well. And again, this could be across how we get access to their data centers, what fees they charge, how we engage their BCP, how we manage their subcontractors. Again, in principle, that could sound like a good thing and take people's views on forcing providers to give us certain cloud requirements, contractual requirements. But again, what does that mean as a firm is your ability to contract with the provider as you want to. And then finally, about a self-regulatory rule book for cloud providers. So one of the things we'll start to see more, certainly around the standards, is a larger number of codes of conduct for providers and firms using cloud, trying to bring those all together, trying to self-regulate this space before having to take some direct legislative action. And we've started to see some codes of conduct on data portability and on switching, which I think is driving the right behavior. It's just whether the self-regulatory side gets there quicker than potentially we need to put the actual formal regulatory side. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully that's helped Alistair with your part.
Alistair, do you want to pick the button up there?
I shall do. I'm going to have to... Marvellous. Thank you, Ross. So I'm Alistair. I'm here with Cloudsoft. Before we get going, I don't want to spend too much time talking to you. I'd rather we were all talking among ourselves, because I think part of the recommendations that David's report really emphasised was the need for us to collaborate and to share knowledge and to really be a community that's pushing the envelope in terms of innovation and cloud adoption. So I'll talk for as short a time as possible. Could I have a quick show of hands? Who here is working for a company that is less than 5 years old? Maybe a fintech startup. Who's working for a company that is more than 20 years old? Yeah. Who here is familiar with public cloud in running their workloads? Okay. Is anyone here from a bank? A service provider? A regulator? Excellent. Great. So we've got a lot of knowledge in this room. We've got a lot of knowledge and experience around where we are, where we'd like to be, and where we've been. I myself work for a company that is a little over 11 years old. Cloudsoft's been around since 2009, helping companies innovate by using public cloud. So we have created software products and tools that we take to engineering teams and geeks to help deploy and manage their applications across clouds. But we also provide consultancy around cloud migration and adoption and best practice, and really help companies at whatever stage they're at along that cloud maturity journey. We try to help them level up, get to the next step. So we've worked with a lot of companies, big and small. I think if I do this, no one needs to see this slide. I'm a geek. I'm a computer science graduate, developer background, application development. I love the cloud. I love what it unlocks. Been working with Cloudsoft for 11 years since we began. And along that way, we've seen the evolution of cloud. We've seen various flavors of public cloud come and go. I need to get my face off the screen. I do apologize. And I really want to view this cloud discussion through the lens of innovation. Now, David's report picked up on what the cloud is and what its benefits are. And I think from our experience at Cloudsoft, talking to startups, to very large investment banks, to telcos, innovation is the real advantage of using cloud. It's no longer talking about cost reduction. It's talking about leveling up the operating model so that we can innovate faster. I'm not going to preach to the choir here, but we realize that innovation is all about reducing that time. Agility is about reducing that time from the business saying, this might be a good idea, to actually having data from the end users to say whether or not it was a good idea. So we exist to help businesses innovate in the cloud. AFME has done a great job democratizing this view and sharing the knowledge. Folk here actually read the AFME report? Has it been well consumed already? Okay, I would urge you to consume some of the lessons that are in it, because it's a good piece of thought leadership there. We're talking about the capital markets, the investment banking space, but if we were to compare capital markets with, say, retail banks of late have been disrupted quite widely by cloud-native fintech startups that have become the darling of the tech scene. We've got the Starling banks and the Monzos. Quite a few of us probably have Monzo credit cards in our wallets. And we love them because they have innovated on the user experience. They have owned the relationship between the tech and the user. They've done away with branches, but we can now pay our checks in by taking a photo of them. Well, they've done away with complicated security requirements, and we can log in with facial recognition. That's innovation. But innovation happens everywhere. It always has. If those of us who are familiar with Gartner's PACE layers will understand that innovation happens at different levels of the technology stack at different rates. Innovation happens, if we're familiar with Wardley mapping, we know that the thing that is cutting edge innovation today will be everywhere, ubiquitous tomorrow. What starts out as a shiny technology bauble or a competitive advantage will over time become a Me Too feature, and then over even more time, people won't even acknowledge it. Electric windows in cars, air conditioning, you name it. The internal combustion engine, you name it. And I like to think of innovation as progressing a bit like this. This isn't a new idea. This divergence, convergence is sometimes talked about as exploration on the left and exploitation on the right. And I think if you think back over virtually any technological innovation, many of them, not all of them, but many of them follow this pattern. There's a need which is identified in some domain. A whole bunch of parties go at it trying to solve this problem or trying to address the need. That results in a whole bunch of competing standards, competing approaches, and then over time, the market will select, or the regulators will select, or best practices will dictate that one or a small number of these available solutions are the ones that we're going to stick with. So let's take a few examples. I mean, the left-hand side of this is kind of like the Wild West. Blockchains were in this category a few years ago. Before that, it was Hadoop and big data, if anyone remembers the hype, the Gartner hype cycle that surrounded that. Before that, it was Docker and containers, which prior to 2013, no one had ever heard of. Subsequent to 2014, no one would shut up about them. And once Docker had come to the fore, I mean, once there's a clear technology winner, that then opens up a new context for additional waves of divergence and convergence. So once Docker became mainstream, suddenly there was a bun fight about how are we going to orchestrate these Docker containers, and we had another wave of technological innovation with startups exploring the space. We had Docker Swarm, we had Mesos, we had Marathon, and of course we had Kubernetes with Google behind it. So then the market chose, with Google's backing, Kubernetes was the clear winner. I don't want to say winner, because that implies there's winners and losers, which implies that the exploratory phase is a winner-takes-all game, which it's not. I mean, this Wild West of startups and academics exploring the space is hugely valuable. We absolutely have to do this experimentation as an industry. But then the innovation comes when eventually just the weight of all these competing alternatives becomes more of an impediment than an enabler, and we as an industry, in this case the financial services industry, will decide a path forward, which then opens up the next wave of innovation. As you can tell, I feel quite strongly about innovation, and I think once you look for this pattern, you see it everywhere. In the 70s and 80s, this would have been computer CPU architecture, it would have been network protocols, it would have been programming languages. And we've seen several things subsequently. I mean, there was a time when an interest only, a daily interest calculation on your mortgage was an innovation. It was a point of differentiation. I'm going to go to that bank because they're going to, if I make a lump sum payment, it comes off straight away and I won't pay. That was an innovation, and now it's ubiquitous. And technology enabled that, by the way, because we're no longer updating ledgers with quills. We've actually got technology to do the heavy lifting for us. And I think, you know, it's totally appropriate that we have that Wild West mindset at the beginning, but it's totally unsustainable for everything to be ad hoc all the time, which is why standards are important. Something that's really big at the moment, I guess, in this field, we're no longer arguing about whether virtualization is a good thing or whether servers in the cloud are a good thing or containers even. Is anyone interested in machine learning? That seems to be one of the new frontiers. Machine learning started off with this pattern as well. AI since the 60s has been a bit ropey, but now we've got really quite mature open source software frameworks around PyTorch or TensorFlow that are very amenable to certain kinds of problems. And the market has chosen that these are the methods on which they're stable enough to build platforms on. Occasionally there's a really happy convergence, no pun intended, between an open source initiative and a vendor-sponsored initiative like TensorFlow. The open source framework is now really well supported by NVIDIA graphics cards, GPUs, with Tensor Core. AWS and other cloud vendors will now sell you, by the hour, Tensor Core capable GPUs to run your machine learning workloads. This was inconceivable 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that we would have this super specialized compute supported by an open source framework that unlocks all this capability for machine learning that everybody wants a piece of now. With that in mind, if we were to sketch out the cloud service landscape at the moment, we would see this broad spectrum of services. Now, don't be overwhelmed by the jumble here. This is kind of deliberate. And I don't want us to argue about which services are to the left or to the right of others, but I just want to convey the point that over time, everything that started off at one time on the right-hand side of this diagram, where it was all a free-for-all, we were exploring, we were experimenting, over time, it moves to the left, or I should say, since you're looking at me, over time, it moves to the left. So things that were once highly disruptive, virtual servers in the cloud, provisioned through a web console, that's mainstream. That's just VMs, EC2 instances. Virtual networks, hyper-converged, hyperscale providers are equally adept at provisioning magical, isolated segments of their networks for us so that it resembles a data center in the cloud. That used to be innovative. That used to be actually really sketchy and quite cutting, quite edgy. Not anymore. This is now a given. And I think everyone in this room is probably comfortable using virtual networks in a public cloud with virtual servers, with virtual disks. Everything's virtual. Similarly, we can move across, managed SQL databases. That alleviates the heavy lifting, right? These are the lessons we've taken from the startup communities. We look at Silicon Valley, we look at the disruptors, we read books by Christensen on the innovator's dilemma, and we understand that there's an opportunity to shake things up. So containers were that thing that helped us embrace microservices. And once we made all our microservices 12-factor, stateless, happy, engineered pieces of code, we can now run them in containers. And now we can even run them in platforms as a service, PaaSes, or even as serverless chunks of event-driven code, and we can spend pennies instead of thousands of pounds a month. Towards the Wild West end, I guess there's an appetite to explore some things like distributed ledger technology and blockchains. Is anyone embracing that? This was all the rage a couple of years ago. AI and ML we've discussed. I think that's a great frontier for helping make sense of data. Internet of Things maybe isn't quite so valuable in this space, but again, the technologies that are underpinning it in terms of real-time streaming and processing of data is very much relevant to this data-hungry space in which we live. I think it's important to focus on that middle bit where services have become stable enough to use, but they're very much differentiated across cloud providers. So yes, we can use PyTorch and TensorFlow across Azure and AWS, but we won't deploy them in the same way. We won't deploy them using the same tools. We can use the serverless framework to abstract our functions as a service, but we can't deploy our AWS Lambdas into Azure yet. They're different. They live in different contexts because they're differentiated, and that, I believe, is because that's how the cloud providers want it. That differentiation is their protection right now. They don't want to be commodities. They will constantly fight against commoditization because once they become commodities, their profit margin is gone. Just look at what happened to the hardware manufacturers. So this differentiation, I think, is going to be here to stay. And I think if we were to look at something like the payments card industry, the data security standard, that followed the diverge converge model. Prior to 2003, there were maybe 5 or 6 really big players in the space, all pushing their own agenda around payment card data security. So you had Visa and MasterCard and Amex and Japanese, there were 5 or 6 big, expensive initiatives. And eventually, that divergence, people realized, wait a minute, we're all trying to solve the same problem. So rather than tackle it through the individual organizations, they founded the PCI organization, the standards body, which then carried the mantle on behalf of everybody in the industry to move forward best practices around data security with payment cards. Now, the reason I mention that is the cloud providers didn't. There were cloud providers, there were technology providers in 2003, 2004. They weren't pushing for that standard. It was the people with the domain knowledge, the knowledge of the problem, that decided to collaborate rather than solve this problem individually. They created a standards body to do it. And now, when you look at AWS and Azure, they will say, yes, we are PCI compatible. Because they will enable you to run PCI workloads in their cloud. Now, because of the shared responsibility model of clouds, the cloud provider being PCI DSS compatible doesn't mean that your workload is automatically compatible, but it enables you to make it compatible as long as you take on the responsibilities that are on your side of the fence. So now as we start to think not about payment cards, or HIPAA would be another example in the healthcare industry where a standard emerged and is now a tick box where you can see, oh, Microsoft, yes, can I run HIPAA workloads there? Yes, you can, if you take care of your side of the shared responsibilities. So now that we're talking about data transparency, maybe we're vexed, we're kept awake at night about explainable ethical AI. Maybe we have to explain the investment decisions our AI made to a regulator. Maybe our machine learning algorithms have to be inspectable after the fact so that we as organizations can justify why we maybe lost so much of our customers' money, or we have to be able to say that we were operating in good faith, that we were following best practice, we were genuinely doing the best that we could, and that the industry consensus is that this was the case. So thinking about data, thinking about investment banks, thinking about capital markets and all the stakeholders involved, particularly the 3 that David mentioned, the banks, the regulators, and the cloud service providers. How do we drive the agenda around standardization? How do we go from this exploratory, exploring divergent phase to the convergent phase that actually allows us to move forward and then unlock the next wave of innovation? So I'd like you to just to pause to consider. Don't answer the question yet, but if you look at this diagram, I'd like you to consider where along that spectrum are the services that your organizations are currently using now. And if you're not in the cloud, then there may be no services. And then I want you to consider which of these services, where on that spectrum are the services that you would really like to start using? And where are the regulators feeling nervous? Because there's always going to be this tension. We're desperate to use the latest and greatest toys, but we have to satisfy the regulator, and the regulator maybe doesn't feel quite so bullish about these technologies as we do. And that's fine, but there's a tension there. How does this picture change if suddenly we want to embrace not just one cloud, but for the sake of concentration risk or others, we want to use Microsoft and Google and Amazon, or a combination thereof? How does this problem change? Suddenly the governance piece is very different. the cost the cost control piece. AWS has got a great cost control dashboard, but it's not going to show you your Azure virtual machines, is it? The AI and ML, yes, there are standards around software frameworks, but the way you deploy and manage and inspect them and cost them and pay for them and expose access to them is very different. Best practices are different across the clouds. So how can we seamlessly transition from one provider to another to another? Containers are part of the solution, but they're not the only solution. They're not the whole solution. So we'll come back to that again, I hope, when we start to talk among ourselves a bit more. What does interoperability actually mean? And I think it depends on where we are in the capital markets value chain, but also which ITSM hat we have on, the IT service management roles. Are we developers and engineers? Are we deployers? Are we service desk users? Or are we on the business side? Are we the chief risk officer, the chief security officer? Are we a regulator? Are we on the hook for whatever terrible decisions our unwashed engineers make when they're playing with the cloud with their own credit cards? You know, the shadow IT problem is a problem. Anyway, don't get me started on that. Yes, and what do governments think as well? So regulators and governments are kind of hand in glove here, trying to facilitate innovation in our space while protecting our users. So with that in mind, I hope you've paused to consider. I'd like to kind of kick off a discussion, and there's no right answers to this. I just really want to sense the mood and maybe share some experiences and some war stories. People can feel free to chip in, but I'll quickly run through the kind of questions that I think are relevant and interesting for this session today. Which services are relevant right now? Which ones are we already using? Which ones are ubiquitous and tame? Which ones have we tamed? We've domesticated them. And which ones are currently just a little bit too out there for the regulators to feel fully comfortable? Which of our industry initiatives are currently exploring the technology space? Which ones are currently at that tipping point where the weight of alternative solutions is currently feeling a bit uncomfortable? And how do we respond to that? How do your organizations responding, and how do we as an industry respond to that over differentiation? And where particularly would standardization help? If there was a standards body that popped up to say, we are going to have recommendations that we're going to make to the cloud providers and to the regulators to say, this is what we expect of a data warehouse. This is what we expect of value at risk. This is what we expect from real-time analytics. This is what we expect from your machine learning algorithms, inspectability. Where would those standards help, and how do we start to get that conversation going? So those are my thoughts. That's all I have to say just now, but I would love to open this up. Feel free to reach out to me. I've got business cards if folk aren't afraid of taking objects from strangers these days. But feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or to download the report that we made with some input from Gartner around what downtime means and why it might not be the bogeyman everyone thinks it is. But yeah, if the floor wanted to maybe, if you wanted to chair some Q&A, John.
Yeah, well, that's the next phase. So thanks very much for that,
Yeah.
Alistair.
Thank you.
So, with what David went through, there seems to be some real drivers and some real needs out there for which are moving towards or having some degrees of standardisation. Seems that there's a kind of can be some competing and conflicting interest between the various stakeholders, which providers, regulators, users of these services. And it's a bit of a changing feast, which is, if Alice's slide shows, that there's a bit of things tend to move from one end of his funnel of stability to the other. So there's a lot of moving parts with this. But I think the key question is, what does the community actually think? So perhaps first of all, if there are any questions or remarks that you'd like to bring up, then you could address them to here, and we'll move forward that way. Mr. Wright.
Thank you both for the presentations. My question is really on the last point, Alistair. around standards. You gave a short list of how you saw standards. Now they seem to me to be almost benchmarks rather than standards. Benchmarks of performance or benchmarks of how each cloud service would actually operate. Is that, have I understood that correctly, that your standards are really around benchmarks?
I'm not sure I would agree with that. No, I think, again, thinking back to PCI, PCI DSS is a set of best practices. So you're right, it's not a technical, you can't have a robot go and inspect your infrastructure for compliance violations, but you can be audited by a person. The best practices that are mandated by PCI DSS are open to interpretation to a degree. There's a bit of fudge because they represent the industry's general consensus about what constitutes best practice. Some of that has real concrete technical implications around data encryption at rest, encryption in transit, anonymization of personally identifiable information and so on. And some of it is really more about people and processes. So it's about who has access to payment card information. Now, yes, you can audit that at a technical level, but it's more fruitful to audit that at the cultural level. And one of the things David's report picks up on is we need to foster a culture of cloud excellence, not just business excellence in our domain, but cloud hygiene and centers of excellence around cloud. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does.
I mean, I could imagine, I'm not aware of any at the moment, but I could imagine clear parallels between PCI DSS. This is why I brought it up. I see clear parallels between that, which has existed for 15 years, and what we're now looking to maybe come up with in the investment banking space.
Oh, thanks very much. I've just got one more, if I may, for David.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
In the report, I mean, I ran a session on cloud for half a dozen investment banks about 5 years ago. And the thing that kept coming up during the session that they were really, really concerned about was security. And I didn't see anything in your presentation where security became a feature. Is that still a feature, or is it now just gone away? It's not a problem.
It's a very good point. So you're right, security was, I think even less than within 5 years, even like 2 years ago, it was the big concern. From a regulatory perspective, from our firms, less this time round, I think because the industry's done, and the certainly provides a lot to alleviate some of those issues. But unfortunately, security is now morphed into a third party, fourth party, fifth party risk discussion. So it's almost like we've all got over the security hurdle and think, actually, yes, cloud is as secure, if not more secure. The Bank of England came out and said something similar, which was great. But now it's very quickly got this operational systemic risk debate, which is the next one I think we all need to try and get over.
Okay, thanks.
Question here, up front.
Thank you. So, Alistair, just a quick question. What's the level of awareness and demand you're seeing on interoperability in industry? I mean, you see people are really aware, or they're still very early days?
It's certainly not early days. I think 10 years ago, when Cloudsoft was starting to make its multi-cloud management products, we believed that multi-cloud was going to be a strategic thing for very risk-averse companies like banks. A few of them took the bait on the hook that we were dangling, I would say. But as we tried to move into SMEs, there wasn't really much demand for multi-cloud. Funnily enough, that has started to turn around recently. It's almost like we were 5 or 6 years too early in talking about multi-cloud. I think now that cloud has become somewhat commoditized, at least on the virtual servers front and arguably on the containers front as well, people don't care so much about where it runs as knowing that they have options to run it somewhere else if necessary, maybe to run it somewhere else concurrently for an absolutely seamless disaster recovery scenario. I also think that the big cloud outages have become less frequent. AWS in particular has not had a major cloud outage for some time. Azure and Office 365 still annoy their users from time to time with things that are eminently avoidable, shall we say. I'm not even going to talk about Oracle. But yeah, I think people are looking at AWS and Azure as being largely feature equivalent for the boring stuff, the boring end of the spectrum. And once you're in that boring safe space, it's significantly easier to interoperate. But you need strong tool support, whether that tool support is on the deployment and management side. So you've got the serverless framework, you've got, well, Kubernetes obviously is pretty agnostic to where the pods are running. Terraform, Ansible, these things largely work across clouds, although with Terraform you do have to write the plans specifically for each target infrastructure. They're not truly portable. But the tooling is multi-cloud. The tools that we've developed are similarly multi-cloud. But the best practices are different across clouds, particularly in the areas of security of networks and resiliency. The AWS resiliency approach is based around availability zones. It staggered me to discover that Azure offers many regions which don't have availability zones. This blew my mind. Some clouds on the networking side, they try to resemble very traditional networks with switches and subnets and you know, firewalls that resemble the familiar appliances. In AWS, for a long time, it was all based around security groups, which achieves the same thing, but is a bit of a different model. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit on the technical stuff, but by and large, yes, I think cloud interoperability is becoming fashionable again, where previously there was a dip in popularity. And I think that is as a direct result of the commoditization of the boring end of the spectrum.
Can I ask David, on the basis that you've clearly had an extensive contact across your membership, you've got the sense that this is a driving issue, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, so that hybrid approach of using, so the private, the public, even the on-premise, and then multi-provider approach is definitely the way that all of our members are looking at it. And a part of that, I think, is there's the commercial element of engaging more than one vendor to go through contract negotiations, and there's also the contractual, the concentration risk. And then each vendor's obviously got their own unique different services as well, so, yeah.
It surprises me, you know, if you look at, we all like to think the banks are too big to fail, right? But the American Department of Defense has gone all in with a single cloud provider. We all thought it was going to be AWS, but no, it's actually Microsoft that took that $10 billion prize. So they don't believe, the Department of Defense does not believe that there's concentration risk in using a single provider. I guess time will tell if that's wisdom or folly, but
They probably have sharper recourse
yeah.
if they do fail. Can we, is there another question at the back? Yeah, put that there.
Thank you. Do you think that cloud is at the end state? What will come after cloud? What will come after cloud?
Do you want to pick the one, David? What comes after cloud?
There's the whole quantum computing discussion, which is really starting to kick off. Whether that's, you know, directly attributable or not, I'm not sure, but
there are some trends. I mean, there's again, what exercises me is where is the compute happening? And we've gone from having big servers to this serverless thing, which just approximates an infinitely scalable computer. And it strikes me that that was always the promise of cloud computing, was that we were going to get to that point where you pay for what you use, and you don't have to think about infrastructure. It just grows and shrinks according to your needs. And now we see providers like AWS and others moving into the 5G space and actually moving compute closer to the edge. So we'll have, you can now run certain workloads that are latency sensitive. Talking to mobile apps, you can run them in the 5G data centers, not the data centers, the base stations right next to the 5G edge. Similarly, we're seeing more edge compute devices becoming feature equivalent with the AWS control plane itself, like outposts. You can get an AWS, they will put a rack in your data center, so you can talk as if you're talking to S3, but you're storing objects in your data center. You can have file sync devices that live in your data center. You can have EC2 instances running in a rack in your data center, or maybe on the back of a Jeep, or maybe in a commercial airliner. And they, to all intents and purposes, they look like AWS resources, but they're actually running locally because the compute has now moved to the edge. I think we're going to see a blurring of this notion of core and edge and device. I think we're going to see this blurring of that line. Whether or not that's a good thing remains to be seen, but there's a strong push to get things happening closer to the edge.
Any other questions? Have we got some more? We've got, there we go. Sorry, behind you, Gary.
I think particularly in the AFME report, you didn't necessarily spell out something that we're very worried about, which is about risk and compliance. Unfortunately, you've got to send an audit. You've got to send them in to go and check that everything is actually working and as it says it should. And from an operational resilience standpoint, you know, if you're reliant on private and public as well as having on-prem, you know, you've often got workloads which are going across all two of those three perhaps, and therefore part of that load has got to be auditable, compliant. Risk have got to go in and have a look at it, and I think that's a real issue for the. It's an issue I've seen. I don't know if others have seen it in terms of, you know, the cloud providers opening up to the regulators coming in and your own risk management functions going in. Any thoughts on that particular issue?
That was certainly one of the biggest issues in the recent guidelines that came out, was that access and audit right. Cloud providers, for some good reasons, some probably not so helpful, unwilling to let firms and supervisors into their data centers. I think we've got the cloud providers come a lot closer to what the industry needs in terms of the, you know, certifications, third-party audits, looking at supporting pooled audits. But for me, the thing that we need to solve here is that pooled audit, which is how do we get the firms together to go to a cloud provider on their own or via third party to do the audit, which I think is the answer. But you know, our industry, I think, is generally not that great at coming together often for things which are mutually beneficial. And I think that's where we could probably do with some regulatory support.
Yeah, and perhaps having different levels of requirements for the for the auditing, if you like, because you know different organisations have got different requirements, and depending on what they do, you know, some more than others. So.
Yeah.
I think there's also the shared responsibility model that we've mentioned a couple of times, where the cloud provider will guarantee, the way AWS describes it, is security of the cloud. So their data center security, their hardware patching, their cable management, cooling and power and so on. They will guarantee that. So you basically
guarantee mean? I mean, that's
well, they'll give you an SLA around, and they'll have a tick in the box for, again, PCI DSS, HIPAA, around data center security, encrypted hard drives. So even if there was a breach, an attacker can't use anything that they steal. But then the other side of the shared responsibility model is your responsibility, and that is security in the cloud. So not security of the cloud, but security in the cloud. So you're responsible for patching the software that's running on the software side. Yeah. You're responsible for ensuring that the networks are correctly configured. You're responsible for ensuring the S3 buckets aren't readable to the world, and we read about that every few weeks, right? The NHS or the Department of Justice or some other government department has left all our personally identifiable information open to the world. So yes, I think the auditors should be aware that division of responsibilities exists, and they should absolutely go and audit the Azure data centers in the UK to make sure that when they say that they are data standard X compliant, that is actually the case. But we also have to say, well, okay, with that platform in place, that security of the cloud platform in place, how do we then demonstrate that the workloads we're running there are compliant? Can we show that the data is encrypted at rest? Can we show that we've got field level encryption in the database so that it's physically impossible for anyone unauthenticated to see those credit card numbers in the database, for instance? Those are just examples, but I think that separation is really crucial, because you're not responsible for the security of an Amazon data center. It would be ludicrous to have you on the hook for that.
No, but you're responsible for your applications in that data center or running on that cloud, and you've got to be able to have certain access to that information. But and you know, in terms of what's behind it, because if there's networks running in the, you know, that forms part of the cloud, you need to know about those security of those networks.
Sure.
So I'm not sure it's quite as black and white as you picture it, unfortunately.
Sure. I think as more and more of these things become defined in software themselves, so the network configuration is software, infrastructure as code, the server configuration, the firewall rules, they're all generally checked into source code control now. So we can actually audit the source code to say, is this following best practice? We can actually load templates from centres of excellence and use those templates as starting points. And the clouds themselves, the cloud providers themselves, are also providing real-time auditing tools like guard duty, like MACI for identifying personally identifiable information. I'm mentioning AWS services here. But they will provide guardrails. In fact, there's another one. Guard duty is another one that will constantly look at the logs to say, that's suspicious, that firewall port should be closed, this machine's doing something odd. There are measures in place that, okay, it's never going to be airtight, but you can show that you're doing best effort using the tools that are available to you, which will massively reduce both the attack surface and the blast radius if something does go wrong. You can actually mitigate both of those dimensions in the security realm.
I mean, in your view, do you believe that participants and stakeholders are actually got their responsibilities clearly identified between the various groups, between the cloud provider and the cloud user?
I don't know. I mean, perhaps one-on-one they are in certain, use cases. So we've got certain use cases which we think we've got it pretty well clarified in terms of what our responsibilities are. But there could well be a need for standardisation of that, perhaps.
Okay. Over there.
Just to make a comment, so my background previously has been in telco, and over the years, moving to the cloud was the thing for the last 5 years. In terms of security of the cloud infrastructure, the things we did those days were having a group consortia. Specifically, we used Cloud Security Alliance. So we developed standards to have a common agreement as to what level of power supply you would have. And this applies for self-certification. So even if you were to bring your own infrastructure. And the second, in terms of security, what we did is by default, do not trust the cloud infrastructure. So tools have been developed over the last 5 years where you can encrypt, as they mentioned about data at rest security or in transit, where technology exists today where you can keep the keys on your premise while data remains encrypted always in the cloud. So from a GDPR perspective, then they become a data processor, and then it's a matter of security of your virtualization layers, which are already standardized because there are only few vendors out there. And it's fairly, in a sense, if a compliance team did want the data, it's much easier to get data from AWS, I would say, than from your own data center to collect the exact same level of detail today.
Could I just ask, I think you put your hand up to say you're in the regulation side of the space.
The regulator is innovative. It seeks innovation in firms. It has set out the UK innovation programs that you would have seen. It's recently actually documented their lessons learned, if you like, from innovation, which went up on their pages just past week. Also, they want to see competition, and without innovation, you have no competition. So they are really kind of pushing along this line. Balancing that is the operational resilience debate. So what do you need to have in place to be operationally resilient, including security, including your supply management? So there's a lot of that sort of area that you need to actually go and look at the papers to think about how you're actually managing the overall landscape. The other thing I'd say is that actually it doesn't matter which cloud provider you're with. Your firm should be looking at what it does, what is the risk that it is exposed to. And if you're thinking about the responsibilities, it always lies with the firm to do the due diligence in terms of defining those responsibilities. So the root cause effect will always lie with the firm. So I guess they're the things that I would actually call out from that perspective.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot. Thank you.
No, that's okay.
David, you mentioned about standardisation of risk assessment earlier on. Is that an area that AFME is going to particularly focus on, or?
So certainly one of the cloud providers are keen to do.
Yeah.
They would like something where it's easier for them and firms to demonstrate all the controls and risk about moving to cloud and be able to take that to regulators. And regulators obviously wouldn't rubber stamp such a framework, but if everyone could understand what those kind of set questions are to get most people comfortable that if you go through this assessment and this is the outcome, therefore you're more likely to be able to move something to cloud. That's one, I think, where they'd be keen to push. That's more so because the cloud providers are seeing inconsistency across Europe in how firms engage regulators. I mean, obviously, a big benefit to them.
Are there different views from different regulators across Europe on this? I mean, I've never come across a homogeneous form of regulation, views from various regulators in my experience, but is there a common ground across European regulators on this?
Yes, I mean, I mean, the FCA in the UK, as we all know, is often a lot more around proportionate to look at innovation and, you know, leads the way in Europe in most cases. That's, you know, one thing we want to think about over the next 12 months as well. But I'd say our conversations with French regulators, so I think France as a jurisdiction, whether that's a Brexit context or not, is definitely warming to innovation and looking at cloud. They're still seeing the risk around it, but much more accommodating. The same for in Germany with the BaFin as well, but still very much a mixed bag. I mean, around the security, you know, one session's regulator there from, I forget which country now, but Google were there and they said, oh, we'd like to do penetration testing against your, you know, your network to prove it's secure. And the Google representative said, well, you know, we built a network ourselves. It's the second largest network in the world after the US Army. We have no perimeter. You know, what are you trying to test? What is it you want to know? And the whole audit security discussion for me around this regulators, I think it's just, you know, we just need to continue that education and sharing information to get people more comfortable.
Yeah,
I mean, I also think that Google is continuously being pen tested by a lot of people a lot of the time as well.
Yeah.
And that's one of the good things about a lot of these public clouds is that they're consistently and continuously being tested, as opposed to on-prem or in private clouds, where they only really look at their audit and things when it comes to audit time, as opposed to consistently.
Yeah, agreed. Another example is about, you know, firms need to be notified of an incident on a cloud, you know, network if it's material to you as a customer. Well, if, like you say, Google's being potentially pen tested and hacked, you know, thousands of times a minute or an hour, you know, yeah, exactly. How do you work out what's pertinent to share back to, you know? So there's just challenges like that. We just need to continue working through, essentially.
One more question. Yeah, one more question before we conclude.
David, and as you both talked about the sort of the benefits of moving to the cloud, but some of those benefits are mostly realised with sort of born in the cloud applications. Are there additional challenges for, you know, older style, which a lot of, you know, banks will have on-premise applications and their migration to the cloud, because that's where I typically see some of the challenges.
I'd love to answer that. Yeah, I'd love to answer that because I work for a core banking system where we're pushing COBOL into the cloud. And yes, pushing legacy systems like COBOL into the cloud is, I don't want to call it great fun, but trying to fix COBOL running in a virtual machine, running inside a microservice provider is incredibly difficult. And trying to explain to a bank's IT team how they can debug all of this stuff without any COBOL knowledge. Yes, moving legacy things into the cloud is incredibly difficult.
Okay. Well, just before we go, just like to thank our speakers very much for their contribution, and thank you all for your contributions as well. The next events in this programme will be publicised on both of our websites, and please make sure that you rinse your hands before you depart. Don't shake anyone else's hand. Thank you very much.